Hi everyone, and welcome to the Deakin Alumni and School of Law webinar with Dr. Marilyn McMahon. My name is Lauren Hawkins from the Central Alumni Relations team. Today we are broadcasting from the Burwood campus and our webinar topic is The Dark Side of Emoji. Dr. Marilyn McMahon is the Deputy Dean and Associate Professor in the School of Law at Deakin University. Dr. McMahon was awarded a PhD with distinction from La Trobe University. Her research is primarily in the areas of criminal law, criminal procedure, and evidence. She is particularly interested in the intersection of criminal law and psychology and has explored this interface in assessments of criminal responsibility, research on domestic violence, and human rights. Dr. McMahon is a member of the Mental Health Tribunal Victoria and the Australian Forensic Reference Group. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Marilyn McMahon. I'll pass over to you to begin our webinar presentation.
Emoji are widely used in modern messages and are frequently perceived as cute or humorous adjuncts to online communications. But they also have a darker side, increasing the possibility that those communications can be used to manipulate, threaten, and exploit. This webinar today will be based on research that I am undertaking with Dr. Elizabeth Curley, a colleague in the law school at Deakin University. We are investigating how the use of emoji can contribute to legal liability. In our previously published research, we have investigated defamatory messages and contractual liability in the context of free speech. Today, I'm going to focus on our more recent research that investigates how emoji can contribute to criminal liability when used to convey threats or as part of the online sexual grooming of minors. I will describe some of the criminal cases we are analysing, examining how emoji are being increasingly recognised as a facilitator or adjunct to criminal threats and unlawful sexual solicitation made on online platforms such as Facebook, Instagram and Snapchat, and through private messaging. Now, people have been using visual aids, images, pictures, symbols, to aid communication for a very long time. For instance, the smiley face icon, ubiquitous in online messages today, has a history that goes far back beyond the contemporary emoji. Indeed, we have a letter written in the mid-18th century by Bernard Henay, the abbot of a monastery, where he used a smiley-faced pictogram to accompany his signature on the document. But modern emoji, those images used in online communication, that is, communication via telephone text messaging, electronic mail, personal or instant messaging, chat rooms, bulletin boards or similar, were originally developed in Japan in the late 1990s. Since then, their number and variety have increased exponentially, and it is estimated that there are now nearly 3,000 emoji, with many depicting human faces and emotions. What is distinctive about emoji is their ease of use and ubiquity. Mobile phone keyboards now come automatically equipped with them, and more than 5 billion emoji are sent on Facebook Messenger each day. Most emoji are accompanied by text, but nearly 1 in 5 of these messages just emoji alone. These developments have led to emoji being acclaimed as the language of the online era and the fastest growing language in the world. Such is their impact that in 2015, the Oxford Dictionary hailed emoji as the word of the year. A classic text, Moby Dick, has now been translated into emoji, and there is even an emoji movie. What motivates people to use emoji? In addition to their practical benefits of speed and their independence of literacy and particular languages, surveys conducted with emoji users report that they use these and other images to help them to communicate and connect with others and to express emotions. It seems that emoji perform a similar function in online communications to that of small talk and non-verbal behaviour in offline ordinary speech. They inject in emotion, nuance, humour, and sociability. In brief, truncated messages, emoji perform what linguists call a phatic function. That is, it's similar to small talk in offline speech. They facilitate interactions rather than having the purpose of conveying or seeking information. Similarly, just as nonverbal behaviour such as pitch, speed and volume of speech, and gestures and facial expressions inform our verbal communications, emoji can improve our one-dimensional texting by adding emotion. In short, people use emoji to help them express themselves and to assist others to understand them. The point is supported by research from the United States that reported that 70% of respondents to an online survey used emoji, and most believed that these icons help them to connect and to communicate their feelings and thoughts. Interestingly, just over half of these respondents indicated that they actually felt more comfortable expressing their emotions visually through these little emoji rather than voicing them in actual telephone conversations. These findings were especially true for those aged 18 to 24, the group most prolific in their use of emoji. For most people, the use of emoji to facilitate communication is viewed in a positive light. Commentators routinely refer to emoji making messages friendlier and more fun. Their cartoonish quality makes them appear innocent and benign. However, there is a darker side to emoji. At its most extreme, deep web analysts revealed in 2016 that Islamic State followers employed a series of icons depicting ISIS symbols, flags, weapons and execution scenes to communicate with other Islamic State supporters. In a more domestic setting, the very cuteness and playfulness of emoji, combined with the anonymity of the web, makes them an ideal grooming tool to be used by those seeking to sexually exploit minors. Additionally, their key expressive function means that they can be used to convey negative and hostile emotions, as well as positive and warm feelings. Disaffected individuals, including those who are perpetrators of domestic violence, have used emoji in online communications to continue their harassment of their victims. Collectively, this dark side of emoji demonstrates their potential association with criminal liability for threat-related offences and sexual offending. It is this use of emoji that I will now explore. In relation to threats, when analysing online threats communicated by emoji, consider a few recent cases. A court in France recently convicted a young man for sending a text message accompanied by a gun emoji to his ex-girlfriend. The court accepted that the message contained a death threat in the form of an image and that this was a real threat. The offender was fined and sentenced to 6 months imprisonment. In another case, a court in New Zealand considered the role of an emoji in a text message sent by a man to his ex-partner. The message was, "You're going to expletive deleted, get it," accompanied by an aeroplane. The inclusion of the aeroplane emphasised that the man was going to fly from the island in New Zealand where he lived to the other island where the victim resided. The judge sentenced him to 8 months in jail on a charge of stalking. In these messages, the role of emoji was simply to amplify the content of the textual message, with the gun and the aeroplane emphasising the means by which the threat would be effected or the manner in which the accused would get to the victim. The presence of the emoji expanded upon the clear meaning of the message, giving it extra impact and immediacy. The text messages themselves were clearly threatening, and it is unsurprising that both men were convicted. But sometimes the presence of emoji complicates an assessment of threat. This is particularly salient when the messaging is by a juvenile or where the presence of an emoji is prima facie inconsistent with the textual content of the message. On the first issue, how are we to interpret posts by teenagers that appear to threaten harm? As the sign of an imminent mass murder or the misguided, impulsive joking of an adolescent? Postings by juveniles clearly raise issues of impulsivity and intent. The speed with which messages can be constructed and disseminated on the internet, combined with the impulsivity of youth, clearly creates the potential for liability for threats. And indeed, this has arisen in several cases in the United States. Consider one such case. A Californian high school student, LK, was arrested and charged with making a criminal threat after she sent a series of tweets to her 500 followers over the course of 3 hours. The tweets included these messages: "Ain't nobody safe," followed by the 100% emoji, expletive deleted, "want to test me now," hands clapping, "you crazy, I'm crazy too, let's die shooting," and "I really want to challenge, shooting at running kids, not fun," followed by the laughing, crying emoji. This student used more than 40 emoji in her tweets, mostly the laughing face icon. At her trial, her defence was that she did not mean the statements. They were exaggerated, dramatic, and meant to be a joke, a fact that she said was emphasised by the inclusion of those numerous emoji. However, she was convicted and a subsequent appeal was unsuccessful. The appeal court held that the tweets had demonstrated a real threat that had caused sustained and reasonable fear in her victims. Now, turning to adults, cases involving threatening messages that include emoji and are sent by adults have demonstrated a wider range of issues, but the case of Anthony Alonis is similar in some ways to the high school student LK. Alonis was charged with threatening his estranged wife after posting violent messages about her on his Facebook page, including one where he suggested that her head should be impaled on a stick. This message was followed by the tongue poking out emoticon. Alonis argued that the presence of the tongue poking out negated the threat by indicating that he was joking or engaging in hyperbole just meant to shock. Now, the courts didn't accept his argument, and Alonis was convicted, although his conviction was subsequently overturned by the US Supreme Court on unrelated grounds. Another case, this time in New York in 2015, also considered the issue of whether an online message really demonstrated an intent sufficient to attract criminal liability. Osiris Aristi was charged with making a terrorist a threat on his Facebook page after posting an emoji image depicting a police officer with 3 emoji guns pointed at his head. The prosecutor in the case argued that these images constituted a threat to police, making them feel intimidated and harassed, creating fear for their safety and causing alarm and annoyance. Features of the emoji that were emphasised in this case were the clear identification of the class of victim, that is the emoji of the police officer, the repetition of the weapon image, the gun emoji repeated 3 times, the seriousness of the threat indicated by the placement of the guns close to the police officer's head, and the multiple preceding posts that evening containing violent messages from Aristi. Now, it's interesting to note that this case didn't proceed to trial because a grand jury refused to indict Aristi. It appears that they did not believe that the message demonstrated a clear intent to make a terrorist threat and regarded it more as a non-criminal rant or a general statement of dissatisfaction and dislike of police. However, in other cases, defendants have not been able to argue that the threat was harmless or that they did not intend to make a threat. Indeed, in one case in Illinois, the defendant didn't even contest a charge of attempted aggravated intimidation of a police officer. The defendant pleaded guilty after posting a message on his Facebook page that included an expletive, a photograph in which he made a vulgar gesture towards a particular police officer whose photo was depicted in the background and whose nickname was included in the post, and emoji of a handgun pointed at a police officer and also an emoji of a gun. Now, the prosecution argued that the emoji of the bomb had particular significance because it was said to indicate the defendant's membership in a street gang called the Bomb Squad. After pleading guilty, the accused was sentenced to a year's probation. But perhaps the most notable case involving Emoji occurred in Spartanburg County in South Carolina in 2015. The case illustrates the peak of liability for threats made by Emoji, as it involved no text at all, just emoji. 2 men were arrested for stalking after they posted this message comprised solely of these 3 emoji to their victim. What exactly was it said that this message conveyed? Well, the threat that someone would be beaten, that's through the fist, that this would lead to, indicated by the pointed finger, hospitalisation, indicated by the ambulance. Now, before leaving the issue of threats and emoji, it's interesting to note, I think, that this issue has now led tech companies to institute changes in their actual icons. Apple started the trend in 2016 when it changed its gun emoji from a traditional metal and bullets sort of gun to a water pistol. The change wasn't due to the legal cases that I have described. It followed a campaign by an anti-gun lobby in New York called Disarm the iPhone. These activists wanted to, and I quote, change the conversation around guns by symbolically removing the one gun that everyone had in their pockets, end of quote. Apple responded by changing the appearance of its gun emoji rather than deleting it. Subsequently, other major tech companies have followed suit. Google, Samsung, and Twitter also all now have innocuous water pistol type gun emoji. Given that this change effectively turns the gun emoji from a weapon to a toy, it will be interesting to explore the impact of this on the making of online threats. I now have a question for you. I would like your responses, and we'll talk about them at the end of my talk. Now, the other area of liability that I'd like to consider is online grooming using emoji. Children and young people's lives are becoming increasingly digital, with data from the Australian Institute of Criminology, the Australian Bureau of Statistics in 2012, indicating that 90% of children between the ages of 5 and 14 years in Australia have access to the internet, and 29% had their own mobile phones, with both figures increasing with age of the user. Less security conscious than older users, young people may accept friend requests from strangers on social networking sites or interact with someone they don't know while playing a multiplayer game. The presence of inbuilt webcams in many computers and cell phones facilitates exchanging photos and videos with these new friends, thereby facilitating social interaction, but also the possibility of sexual exploitation. Indeed, more than 1 in 10 young persons aged between 11 and 16 years who has a social network profile has received unwanted sexual messages online. Research from England indicates that girls aged between 12 and 15 are the most likely to be targeted. Facebook, Instagram, and Snapchat are the most common sites used by offenders. Now, a general term for the manipulation of children into sexual victimisation is grooming. Grooming is a course of conduct engaged in for the purpose of sexually exploiting a child or young person, either online by, say, getting them to send sexually explicit photographs or videos, or by arranging to actually physically meet them and abuse them. Now, I should mention in passing that in recent years, many jurisdictions have reacted by creating offences that criminalise online contact with a minor for a sexual purpose without requiring that the contact result in actual physical contact or offending. But to return, a distinctive feature of online grooming is the use of emoji, emoticon, abbreviations, netspeak and slang in online grooming conversations for the purpose of getting young victims to trust the offender. Research by Connie Barber and Sylvia Battez analyses actual online conversations of convicted online sexual offenders and has reported that the use of emoticons and emoji were the most common extrinsic characteristics used by these offenders. Now, given the popularity of emoji among young people, it is perhaps unsurprising that they feature in sexualised online exchanges. The mother of one 11-year-old victim of online sexual offending described the process as follows, and I quote, "It began with the offender sending her friendly messages, a few jokes, some emojis thrown in, all relatively innocent," end of quote. In another case involving a request to see the naked body of a minor, the request was accompanied by the emoji of a love heart. And when the high-profile English footballer Adam Johnston stood trial for 2 counts of sexual activity with a minor, his online communications with the victim, in which he encouraged her to send him photographs of herself naked and arranged 2 meetings with her, included multiple use of emoji. One particularly damning instance of his emoji use followed the victim's online disclosure that she was just 15 years old. Johnson then sent her an emoji of a monkey covering its eyes. The prosecution seized upon this message as demonstrating that Johnson was aware that his victim was underage and was choosing to ignore this. The feeble defence strategy was to argue that Johnson was simply immature and he liked using emoji. Johnson himself gave evidence at his trial that he used the monkey emoji because it was, quote, "just a funny picture." Unsurprisingly, he was convicted of the charges and sentenced to a term of imprisonment. Now, it's noteworthy that many of the online grooming exchanges contain emoji that have a double meaning. This complicates their interpretation, as on the face of it, some messages may appear innocent in nature with their true purpose of flirtation and sexual solicitation hidden behind particular emoji. For example, most people are now aware that the eggplant emoji represents a penis and cherries represent breasts. But there are many other coded emoji that are used by sexual offenders. Chains, for example, indicate kinky sex. 2 hands, in the manner demonstrated on screen, represent sexual intercourse, etc. Those investigating online grooming now have an app that will translate these emoji for them. And this was significant in a recent prosecution in Australia. A Queensland man was charged with using a carriage service to groom a minor for sexual activity after he used what police described as X-rated emoji to communicate with a 12-year-old girl. According to police, the offender used these emoji in social media, text messaging and gaming platforms to contact the girl and groom her for the purpose of arranging actual contact and offending. Most messages containing emoji also contain text. Hence, on most occasions, the task will be to interpret the meaning of the whole message, not just the emoji, but the words as well as the emoji that were present. Now, as Susan Herring, a professor of information science and linguistics in the United States, has pointed out, and I'll quote, "Emoji in isolation could cause some puzzlement, but in the context of a textual message, the sender's intended meaning of an emoji is usually clear." That's the end of the quote. Consequently, for most messages, the meaning will be able to be determined by examining the text and then considering the function of any accompanying emoji. In most of the cases we've considered, the function of the emoji has been to amplify the textual message, that is, to heighten the threat, as occurred, for example, in the messages where the men threatened their ex-partners and included emoji of guns and planes. And similarly, the person who threatens to blow the head off a named police officer and who accompanies the post with an emoji of a gun pointing at the head of an actual police officer might expect to be found liable for making a criminal threat. And a man who sends a photograph of himself to a naked girl covering his genitals with a smiley face emoji can also expect to be found liable for a grooming offence. However, sometimes potentially criminal online communication can be negated or at least made ambiguous when accompanied by emoji. As previously noted, just as much of spoken language is modified by nonverbal behaviours, gestures, volume, tone of speech, the presence of emoji can change the meaning of an online communication. Now, there are three key issues that commonly arise as interpretive challenges in relation to emoji, and you'll see them on the screen. The first is where the sender claims that the emoji indicate that the message was humorous rather than intentionally criminal. I've already described the cases of LK, the Californian high school student who was convicted of making a criminal threat after she threatened to shoot students at her high school. I've described the case of Anthony Elenis, the man who argued that his Facebook message suggesting his ex-wife's head should be impaled on a stick was simply black humour, and Adam Johnson, who sent his victim an emoji of a monkey covering its eyes, see no evil, when she told him she was underage. In essence, all three of these defendants argued that they did not have the relevant criminal intent for the offences with which they were charged. Instead, they claimed to have been acting in a humorous manner, perhaps misguided and unfortunate, but devoid of any serious intent to do wrong. Now, central to this defence is the claim that the presence of the emoji neutralised any possible threat and demonstrated that they were sending funny pictures rather than engaging in criminal threats or grooming. In each of these cases, courts rejected that explanation, and the repeated messaging persuaded courts that the threats and grooming was intentional and criminal. However, it is possible that in some future case, a court will accept that the presence of emoji neutralised or negated an otherwise prima facie criminal threat. The second interpretive difficulty relates to coding. Now, concern about coded messages has a particular significance in grooming cases where apparently benign or cute emoji have an X-rated or double meaning. This could potentially complicate prosecutions. But it's important to recall that courts have dealt with issues like this before. It is arguable that emoji are similar to slang, not infrequently used by gangs who are subject to criminal prosecution. In those cases, courts have sometimes been able to determine the meaning of exchanges between gang members or have been able to call on witnesses, including expert witnesses or defendants themselves, to explain the meaning of the slang used. A similar approach could be used with the use of X-rated emoji. In addition, as previously noted, law enforcement organisations can also utilise apps that decode apparently innocent but double meaning emoji that are used in grooming. Now, the third and final challenge that I want to mention is the one that confronts the courts when they consider the role of emoji in these cases, and it's caused by cross-platform variability. What I mean by that is a person who sends an emoji from, say, an iPhone cannot be certain how it will appear on an Android phone, for example. In essence, due to differences in the way each of the tech companies constructs their emoji, the image seen by recipients using one type of phone may not be the same visual representation that was sent by a person who sent the message from another type of phone. You can see this in the images displayed on the screen here. Those images are all of the same, if you like, representation or the same icon, but depicted differently on different platforms. Now, to give you a case example of this, consider Adam Johnson's message containing the purple devil emoji, which he sent to his 15-year-old victim. It would display in different ways on various platforms, appearing as satanic in Facebook, relatively benign in Messenger, and simply devilish in Apple. It wasn't an issue in Adam Johnson's case, but this variability introduces the possibility of cross-platform confusion and misinterpretation, and it's always something that should be considered when assessing the criminal liability of a person when emoji are involved. This is particularly relevant when gun emoji are used. I mentioned earlier that most major tech companies have now changed their gun emoji so that they appear more like harmless toys rather than actual weapons. But this only applies to the latest versions of software. Users using older software will still see older versions. Hence, it is possible that a person could send a message with a gun emoji and it could appear on the sender's phone as a benign water pistol, but on the recipient's phone as a traditional and much more threatening gun. Well, in summary, what I hope to have done today is convey to you something about our research. After reviewing and analysing cases from various jurisdictions involving online threats and grooming, we believe that while the inclusion of emoji in digital communications presents distinctive interpretive challenges for courts, imposing criminal liability for threats for the grooming of minors or those threats themselves conveyed by emoji simply demonstrates the evolution and adaptation of the criminal law to the digital age. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you for that wonderful presentation. It's now time for our Q&A with the audience. I will give you a couple of minutes to send your questions in via the question box, and we will try to get through as many as possible. Okay, so we have Sandy asking, what impact does emoji use have on workplace communications?
Well, it's an interesting question. We didn't look at it in the research I've described today, but it did come up in our earlier research where we looked at things like actions for defamation, where something had been said in a post about a fellow worker or something like that. So the emoji were there used in at least one case in the United States where what looked like a defamatory comment had been made about an individual, followed by a smiling face emoji, and that was a particular instance where the emoji was said by the court to take away the defamatory sting. So it's an interesting one, I think, where in that case, the use of the emoji made what might otherwise have been a defamatory comment not defamatory. That I know is a very particularised instance of emoji in the workplace. More generally, I guess the only thing that I can add to that is that we did come across research about emoji and the workplace, and it generally indicated that people are much more likely to use emoji in their social communications rather than in their workplace communications. There was a perception that perhaps the use of emoji in professional emails, for example, between fellow workers or other people associated with work-related issues, made the person using the emoji look less professional.
Excellent. So our next question is, on balance, do you think emoji are harming or enhancing our communications?
Look, I think my response to that is really that emoji probably have the same sort of role that non-verbal behaviour does. And that's so it neither enhances nor has a negative impact. It's integral. It's part of what we do with our online communication. So it's like non-verbal behaviour generally. It can be used positively or negatively. We use it as an adjunct to our communications, and it's inherently neither good nor bad, I think. It's the purposes or the intent with which people use it that determines whether it's a good or bad thing.
Excellent, thank you. And now Julie has asked, I teach children with autism. Do you have any suggestions for their safety?
Look, it's a really interesting question, Julie. What I would direct you to is there are some really good websites that I've come across in this research, a couple of them from England, and they have practical guidance as to what you can do. I'm not aware of any particularly related to children with autism, though they may exist, but what you can do to protect minors from the sorts of unwanted communications that I've been describing today in the grooming part of my talk. So what I would suggest, there's a couple that come to mind immediately from the United Kingdom where law enforcement groups or concerned parents, or I think there's a centre for online communications and sexual exploitation of minors that provide guidance of exactly the sort that you're seeking. And I would suggest that they will provide more nuts and bolts, practical advice that I can give you. And I think if you're interested, it would be really good to go online and find those sites and get some protections for the children you're describing.
Excellent. Now our next question is about Bitmoji, which I use quite a lot. Alex has asked, what about the increased use of Bitmoji, with personal characteristics of the user becoming part of the emoji?
That is a fascinating development. Yeah. I haven't seen that in any cases so far. So it'll be very interesting. Again, this is, constantly evolving and a really interesting development. But there's the time delay or lag, if you like, between this occurring as a development and appearing in criminal cases. So I'd have to say we're monitoring it, very interesting development, but we haven't seen it so far in the criminal cases that we're considering. They might be in the pipeline, but they haven't hit the courts yet.
And how long does it normally take from these things happening to them hitting the courts and the outcomes becoming research and law?
That's a very difficult question to answer. Basically, it's affected by a number of things. For example, if the accused pleads guilty, it will get before the courts much more quickly. A person who's contesting the charge, it will be delayed somewhat because there'll have to be a contested hearing. And relevant to the time delay there will be how serious the matter is. In Victoria, if it's not very serious or relatively less serious, I should say, it will go before the magistrate's court. It's likely to get on relatively quickly there. If it is a more serious threat, it will be listed for one of our superior courts, county court or Supreme Court. The delay is longer there. You've also got not only the matter appearing in the courts, but also being reported so people like me can read about it. So often we're talking about a lag that could be anywhere between a couple of months to 2 years or so. So it depends on a number of factors, the response of the accused person particularly, as well as the seriousness of the threat, the nature of the charge, which court it will be heard in.
Excellent, thank you. Now Gemma has asked, have there been cases where the racial variations of emoji have played a role?
Not criminal cases. I have seen some reference to racist use of emoji, but thus far it hasn't appeared in any of the criminal cases. We've basically looked at, thus far, civil cases, tortious liability, things like defamatory statements, contractual liability. There was a case in Israel, and the criminal cases I've described to you today, which largely deal with this making of threats as well as grooming. So I think it's a minefield, and I think it's an interesting one, but I'm not familiar with any cases. What we are familiar with, of course, is the mammoth expansion. I mentioned to you the enormous increase in the number of emoji, and that's partly been driven by the desire to have more representative emoji, especially these anthropomorphic ones, that represent human faces. Many of the original complaints that came through was that there was basically Anglo features, and that they were not sufficiently diverse to be truly representative of the world population. So we do have now, in recent years, an increase, if you like, in cultural and ethnic diversity and religious diversity in emoji, but there's also the potential, obviously, for that to be negatively used.
Thank you. And our next question comes from Sandra. It is not only differences between platforms that can make interpretation of what was sent confusing. I also don't always know what the emojis, especially faces, mean. How can this be overcome, and would not always knowing or guessing what emoji means be used as a defence by some defendants?
It's a very good point, and it's one that I didn't mention today and should have. Not only is there the cross-platform variation, but for many emoji, there's no certainty about what people attribute to them as their meaning. So let's take at one end of the spectrum, you've got something like the simple smiley face. That's almost universally understood. People have positive attributions, they see it as a positive, happy face. There are lots of other emoji, and there's research about this specifically coming from the United States, where people don't agree that the subjective interpretation of one person about what a particular icon represents may be very different from the subjective interpretation of another person about what that particular icon represents. So it's a very good point. In addition, another factor that complicates the interpretation of emoji is once you move away from what we might see as the very simple emoji, like the smiley face, especially where you get more complicated or less obvious representations, or more subtle, if you like, emotions being represented in emoji, then you do get the sort of variability that has been described, and less certainty and agreement between recipients and senders about what was intended by the message. And that is, it's good to note, that is a further interpretive challenge.
Excellent, thank you. Should we touch on the answers to the poll questions?
Yeah, I'd be interested to see what they are.
Okay, so our first question was, have you or an immediate family member ever received an online message that you perceive to be threatening? So we've had 100% of people who responded say no.
Well, that is interesting. Yeah, that is interesting. It's very pleasing to hear that our people listening haven't been the subject of a threat. I guess I shouldn't be surprised, though, when I reflect on it, because given that I've said to you that we've got 5 billion emojis just being used daily with Facebook Messenger alone, the number of cases that we're seeing coming through the courts isn't very great. We've been Elizabeth Curley and I have been researching this for over a year now, and we're seeing an increasing number of cases, but certainly we're not seeing the floodgates opened. We're not seeing masses of cases coming through the courts. So it may be that we're looking at a relatively unusual phenomenon. Given the number of emoji that are used, it may be that threats aren't very commonly made by them, and that's a good thing.
Excellent. And our second question was, do you know of a young person, sorry, that was just loading up. Do you know of a young person under 16 being groomed online through family or friends, not in the media? So we have 84% of people saying no and 15% of people saying yes.
Okay, that would be more consistent with what the research says about the sorts of unwanted sexual contact that occurs through online messaging. I'd be interested to break that down a bit more by looking at people with children, people without children, that sort of thing. But broadly, it doesn't surprise me. I guess what I would be more interested in is the sort of research that's been done in England, where they ask young people themselves whether they have been contacted, inappropriately with some form of sexual messaging, because my suspicion is that many young people don't disclose this to their parents. And they don't disclose it to their parents because it's exactly the sort of thing that their parents warn them about, may shut down some of their usage of online communications, internet access. So I think that this is the sort of response I would expect from the audience that we have. But I think that probably the more interesting information will come from young users themselves, because I suspect that they underreport what's happening to their parents because of that fear of, being shut down or having their internet access monitored or in some way limited.
Thank you for that. So now we'll return to your questions. We have a little bit more time. So Emma has asked, do you think as more cases come into the public spotlight in respect of the impact of using emoji, this will change the way that emoji are used in communication? I.e., will those trying to groom young people stop using them completely? Also, in cases where the emoji have been found to be threatening or grooming, how much background was there which formed a context for the use of emoji?
To take that second question first, typically there was quite a deal of background. The people who were charged with these various offences, once you read the case histories, they are not isolated acts. So LK, the high school student in California who sent those texts basically threatening to shoot people at her school, had a number of issues in her background. She was known to police. The Osiris Aristi, the character I mentioned, who also was involved with emoji and threats, also had prior police contact. The two men in South Carolina with the stalking had prior violent interactions with their victim. So what we're typically seeing in these cases is that the online communications using the emoji are part of a history of interactions, or at least difficulties, manifest by the people who've been charged with the offences. That troubles me a little bit, because it seems to me that if you move too far down that track, then what you're doing is assessing the character of the accused. You're making them liable because of who they are rather than what they've done. And that is a bit troubling. So, yes, it is taken into account, the prior interactions, and many times that will be relevant to the criminal offence. But sometimes reading these cases, I'm a bit troubled because I think they are going into the character of the accused and, as I said, prosecuting them for who they are rather than what they've done. Now, the first question, I've forgotten.
The first question?
The first part of that question.
I'll grab that one up for you. So the first question was, do you think as more cases come into the public spotlight in respect to the impact of using emojis, those trying to use them to groom young people will stop using them completely?
Look, I can't, it's an interesting question. I don't know. On people who engage in online grooming are basically engaging in very manipulative behaviour. They use emoji because the very qualities I described, sociability, they increase trust. They let one offender who was using emoji in England was 92 years old. He was using emoji because he wanted to appear more like his victims. That is, it's uncommon for 92-year-olds to be familiar with emoji and internet communications like that. So what he was doing was deliberately misrepresenting himself as a younger, if you like, more with it sort of person. And the use of the emoji was part of that strategy. So online people who engage in online grooming use emoji as part of a general set of manipulative tactics to increase trust by their victims, to make their victims think that they're more like one another than they are in reality. I suspect that they'll continue to use emoji because basically they take advantage of the positive aspects of emoji. They're friendly, they're fun. They allow people to anonymously present themselves as something which they're not. The 92-year-old offender who's presenting himself as some fun, young person who, is engaging as an equal with a 15-year-old girl. So I suspect that they'll continue to use emoji and they'll exploit the positive aspects.
Excellent. Now we have time for one last question. We've got one from Brenton asking, do you know of any instances of emoji used from government agencies that has backfired?
No, I don't. No, I can't think I'd be interested, as always, I'd be very interested if there are cases, because emoji are used so ubiquitously by consumer organisations, across the board, and I would imagine by government agencies, but I can't think of any instance in which it's backfired. So if anyone out there knows of such instances, I'd be very interested to hear about it.
Excellent, thank you. And if you do know of those instances, you can email them to deakinalumni@deakin.edu.au and we can pass them on. So that's all we have time for today. Thank you for joining us. And thank you again to Marilyn for spending this time on a wonderful webinar that explores something that I'm sure most people use in their daily life. Remember, you can submit feedback to us at deakinalumni@deakin.edu.au, and a recording of this presentation will be made available on our website within the next 2 weeks. You can also connect with us on social media on our Facebook and LinkedIn pages. Have a wonderful day, everyone, and we hope you can join us again next time.